All right. It's Jeff Mayhew. It's John Beatty. It's Politics and Parenting, where we talk about politics, but we talk about it differently. John, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well, Jeff. Actually, I am elated because our podcast has lasted longer than the previous Speaker of the House, and we have a new Speaker of the House. And one of the things, it's what is it? I'm just looking at Wikipedia. Mike Johnson. So one of the things that
Can't
Mike
even remember his
spoke
name.
about, oh, he's so new, he's so fresh. He quoted the Bible in his speech, and there's sort of this hubbub about like, oh, the separation of church and state and stuff. And it's like, calm down, people. Like Lincoln was quoting the Bible all the time. It happens in speeches, but and I will say this: there is a precedent for the government acknowledging a religion and sort of working around it. And this is one of my favorite examples. So we've got election day coming up, and people joke in Virginia now that election day is like 45 days, but November 7th, I believe, this year, because it's the first Tuesday of the month. But the actual rule is that it is the Tuesday preceding the first Monday of the month. And do you know why that first Monday of November? Do you know why that is, Jeff? Because we Catholics celebrate All Saints Day on November 1st. And in an effort to appeal to a particular religious base in the beneficence, if you will, so the national election day was set to be after a major Catholic feast day at the time, so that people could actually show up to the polls and vote. So it's not a sort of establishment of state religion, if you will, but it's an accommodation for people's religious faith. And so I think we need to like recognize that people have different religious views. They can acknowledge their religious views in a public speech about an organization that is, technically non-religious. But I think we need to like give people that sort of space. And I think like election day being that sort of that first Tuesday after the first Monday of the month is just sort of recognition of like where we are as a country. We're a multicultural, a plurality. And I think that leads really well into our guest as we talk about why Congress.
That's right. And I mean, I kind of saw the same things that you saw. I read the speech, and our founders' intent was not to keep like religion out of government. It was to keep government out of religion in a lot
Yeah.
of ways, and it's like, and to allow all religions a space to be, as you kind of alluded to, is like we need to give people space to be themselves. And that's kind of my big argument with Congress, is it's too small. It's not a deliberative body, and there's not enough space for the different factions of the United States to be itself. And we'll obviously get into that in a little bit with our guest Philip Wallach, who wrote the book Why Congress. But we had our Halloween party here yesterday, John. And how does it, like, I don't know. For me, it's so weird because I've had this party every year since I was like 7 years old, and now my kids are doing the same thing that I did. Riding on the hay ride with my dad, and all of my friends were kind of in town this year, or some of them were in town, and they got to meet some of my kids, and it's just like their kids look like they used to look, and it's just this, I don't know, this really weird but lovely situation I find myself in. How do you find yourself looking back at all of this stuff and like how life changes? And I don't know, do you find yourself feeling old like me?
Uh, some days. No, I went for run this afternoon, and I could really only do like 2.5 miles, and I was like, I'm kind of tired right now. So sorry, a mile and a quarter, and then I was like, I'm really tired, so I'm going to run back home. No, it's like, I mean, I've only been at your Halloween party for 2 years, so I'm not know the history. But my children go to the school I went to, so it's kind of like I have that sort of sense of like there's sort of a tradition that they're part of. And then the school had this they called a fall festival on Saturday, right before your party. And again, I'm like sitting next to a classmate of mine, who's a year behind me in high school, and now we both have children in this lower school that we're going through. So yeah, like, you get older, your kids kind of grow up with you, and I just find it wonderful to sort of being able to share those traditions with your children, because they're dear to you, and like it's important to remember where you came from and who you are. And then it's also fun to sort of like see everyone get older and see everyone progress and just grow into themselves. So and that's one of the wonderful things about Halloween is it is a tradition that we partake in. And you know, it's the same thing. Like one of my children is a soldier, and I remember many years going as a soldier. So it's fun to reminisce and you know, see them grow up just as we're growing up.
Yeah, I got to see some of my friends that I haven't seen for a while because of they were in town for another reason, but they came to the party and they were talking about their kids, and I was like, they kind of, like not complaining, but like just, you know, I guess complaining. I mean, let's face it, all
Yeah.
of us parents complain, like we're frustrated at our kids. And I said,
We critique our children, but not in front of them, so it
I
doesn't do
said,
anything.
is, speaking of the child that they were talking about, because they have multiple children, I said, do you find that that kid is more or less like you? And they were like, oh, definitely like me. And I said, so do you find yourself getting mad at the child or yourself? And they were like, oh, I'm definitely mad at myself. I know this.
Too
But
close to
and like
home.
I think every parent goes through that moment, and I think
Mhm.
that moment kind of happens between like 7 and 10. That's when like the child really, like, all of your like negative traits that you've instilled on them have like really soaking in, and they've discovered all of their power, but they don't understand any of the consequences yet. So they're just like wielding this power like little tyrants. And you as a parent, like, what are you supposed to do? You love them. You want to keep them safe, but at the same time, you want to lock them in a cage and let them be until they know how to behave like a human civilized person. But you can't do that. So, because
No,
you're,
it's so true because so our oldest has started babysitting now, and he has a tendency to like kind of scold his siblings and yell at them. And part of me is like, this is probably a habit I've instilled in him because I've probably scolded him and yelled at him too many times. But I'm having flashbacks to when I was babysitting my siblings and being like, yeah, like it isn't as effective as I thought it was. And like I got to find a different tack. And I kind of want to be like, you just got to find a different way to like get again, like as we talk about in politics, like you sort of have to like convince people and persuade them and find a common ground and bring them around and
yeah.
you know, there's that wisdom that he doesn't have yet that I wish I could just like insert into his brain so that
I talk to my older kids all the time because they kind of do the same thing. Like, I mean, there's always a time where authority has to be reigned, right?
Mhm.
Whether it's in business or like team sports or parenting. There comes a moment where you have to wield that authority, where if nobody's listening, you have to grab their attention. I think the difference is like the child doesn't understand that. So the child
Yeah.
just sees the authority being wielded and they think, okay, anytime I need something done, I wield authority. And I've tried to explain to my kids, I'm like, dad doesn't get upset and like raise his voice for no reason. I mean, sure, there are plenty of times where dad is just a human being who is flawed, who makes a mistake. But on the majority of times, dad's being thoughtful. He has been patient. He has waited and he's grasped your attention by raising his voice. And he's not scolding you. He's typically giving you instructions on how to do something. That's just all you hear is the loudness. And so that's
That's right.
kind of
Yeah.
where you go as a child when you're trying to wield authority. And it's like, no, you got to make sure that you're being clear and concise about your instructions. And then if they're being ignored for far too long, yeah, you got to raise your voice to get them their attentions. I mean, my twins they're so sweet and so nice. And sometimes I just like, look, you have to listen to me. I'm like, you're just like, we've been going at this for 10 minutes. And, I raise my voice and they get a little scared, but I put a smile on at the same time to kind of bring them back to be like, look, I scared you because you were just ignoring me. And like, I can't have you keep ignoring me. So, because we got to get this done. You want to go do all these things and mommy and daddy want to make it happen, but like, we're on a schedule.
That's right. We want to carve pumpkins, but you got to take a nap beforehand. And if you don't take a nap, you're not going to get part carved pumpkins.
or eat or eat lunch. Like who thought it was going to be so hard to feed kids? Come on. So, we've got a guest today. Very excited about it, John.
Waiting in the green room right now, so we got to stop this
I
bantering.
I know we got to stop the banner. We got to get to it. All right, we are joined today by a special guest, Philip Wallach. He is a senior fellow at AEI and an author of Why Congress, and he's here today to talk to John and I about just that. Why Congress? So, Philip, how are you doing today?
Great. Thanks for having me with you guys.
So, John and I, we both ran for Congress last cycle in Virginia, and we study it regularly. We picked up your book, and I gotta say, it's fantastic. The first question I have for you is like, what drove you? What was your passion? What was your mission? What you drove you to writing about why Congress?
So it's a great question. So I'm not a lifelong Congress scholar. Uh, I'm somebody who thinks of myself as a student of the American policymaking process pretty broadly, and specifically sort of how the separation of powers really plays out in practice. Um, and the reason I've come for the last 5 or 6 years of my life to focus pretty deeply on Congress as an institution is I sort of felt like, in thinking about what goes wrong with our system, uh, Congress seemed like the wobbly leg of this three-legged stool. And thinking about why there's why we have a sense that the administrative state does too much, or does the wrong things, or is unaccountable. And my feeling is a lot of that comes back to Congress, and Congress abdicating its proper constitutional responsibilities, and just generally failing to live up to the role that we need our representative body to play. So that said, I'm not somebody who wants to just give up on Congress. I think we need very badly to think about how we can revive the body and get it working for the American people. If we give
That's
up on it, I really think we are giving up on political freedom, and that sounds pretty dramatic, I guess, but that's what I think. That Americans' political freedom is really tied up in having this exercise of self-government through Congress.
yeah,
And that I think a lot of folks who study congressional dysfunction are pretty much ready to give up on the place. They just want to find reforms that
yeah.
are basically about making it less obnoxious to the rest of the government, so that the rest of the government can do what they think is necessary without Congress bothering it too much. And I think that's totally the wrong reaction. It's an understandable reaction, but it's the wrong way to go. So my book is an apologia for the institution, because I think that's needed, and I think even the members themselves need that today.
Yeah, no,
Yeah,
I
you.
mean, go ahead, John.
You talk about this idea that everyone who's kind of studying Congress has this idea like they got to get rid of it. And so in the book you talk about Woodrow Wilson, and he comes around and sort of has this idea that we need to fix Congress, and he's got sort of machinations for how it should go. And then when he becomes president, you note that he kind of changes his mind on that. But um, from my understanding, you've kind of have this two ideas: there's sort of a Madisonian branch and a Wilsonian branch. And how would you kind of compare and contrast, like in the sense that like James Madison,
Right.
obviously father of the Constitution, and then Woodrow Wilson coming in and trying to reorganize everything?
Right. So for me, the distinctive thing about a Madisonian approach is this realization that multiplicity is the defining feature of Republican government, and understanding the ways in which Congress allows you to cope with that multiplicity. And I think Madison is just such a deep thinker in thinking about how factions can play off against each other, but also in the process sort of cross-fertilize with each other and figure out ways of living with each other. For Wilson, I think the whole idea of multiplicity is basically offensive. He recognizes there is diversity in the country, but we pretty much want to make politics as simple as possible. It reminds me of people who admire the aesthetics of Apple electronic devices today. Everything as clean lines as possible, sort of simplicity is beauty. That's sort of the Wilsonian vision. And so basically you want to get everything streamlined into very tidy lines of competition between the two political parties, let the voters make their choice, and then whoever wins ought to be sort of in charge of the government in a very authoritative way. They ought to be able to implement their program. And Wilson was a great admirer of the UK's Westminster parliamentary system. Specifically, he thought the Prime Minister William Gladstone was sort of the model of how an energetic politician should be able to transform a country's government and society, and he wanted very much to emulate that. Earlier in his career, he sort of imagined some of that simplifying process happening within the Congress through caucuses in the parties. But as he went along later in his career, he sort of became more and more attracted to the president as the sort of one figure who could really deliver this simplicity, and sort of wanting Congress to become the handmaiden to the president because of the president's sort of towering presence on the political scene. And, you know, I don't want to deny that Wilson's vision has a lot of attractive qualities about it. I think that would be a mistake. People are very attracted to this idea that if you don't have simplicity, you can't have true accountability. I think that's wrong, but it is understandable. So yeah, part of the point of my book is to argue why in America's case, especially, we are such a complicated country, so diverse, so many different factions. We really need to allow this ongoing process of negotiation and accommodation to have a central place in our politics. We can't just expect political parties to tidy up everything for us, or in any case, they're not managing that feat in recent years.
So yeah, I've got a note like about, there's a quote, or just quoting your book, like, what would happen to the quote mischiefs of faction, Madison's central challenge for Republican political life in a system envisioned. And so I guess Wilson thinks in essence parties would be responsible for taming factions on their own terms before offering up their syntheses for the adjudication by voters. And so I think we see that was the case for probably 10 to 20 years, but in the most recent like decade, it's like definitely fallen off the rails, especially on the Republican side. And I think that seems to be where there's so much dysfunction nowadays.
Right.
And I think even on the Democratic side, like if you get a small enough cohort and a small enough margin, the party actually can't control their faction. And now we're back to sort of the same multiplicity where as much as the party thinks they control everything, like a small number of people can throw everything into chaos.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think the question of the adequacy of our bipolar politics is really at the heart of this question. I mean, I think there are people who think, well, Republicans and Democrats, they're as different as night and day, and giving voters that choice is good enough. I think it's more and more clear that that's not adequate. That the American electorate is dissatisfied with the way that these two parties were framing things. I think you already see a lot of ferment, especially on the right. There's an awful lot of internal disagreement in these parties, and you're starting to see some younger leaders coming forward who embody just very different values. So I think that's sort of the multiplicity of factions reasserting itself, and we need Madisonian responses to that problem rather than just digging in our heels and hoping that the existing lines of the sort of familiar lines of confrontation are good enough.
Yeah. So when I read this, I love the way that you put in the terms, the Madisonian and the Wilsonian. I thought it was very modern for like an everyday citizen to kind of comprehend, because everybody, whether how deeply you know government, you kind of know the two names, Madison and Wilson. And I couldn't help notice some of the similarities between the Madisonians and like the original Democratic Republicans, and then the Wilsonians and the Federalists. Right. It's almost this idea of, like you said, the Madisonians were about the multiplicity of factions, allowing them to kind of like work against each other and for the country. And the Federalists and the Wilsonians are all kind of about consolidated power into the hands of like the most virtuous or the most knowledgeable. But, that's really hard for citizens to know. Right. Which is
right.
I think part of the flaw with the system, because
right, yeah.
all it takes is the wrong people in charge.
I think that the Wilsonians want to say, well, of course, there's this common good, and the people in charge are going to ascertain what that's all about and then go after it. And it does require an awful lot of trust. right? And yeah, I think the Federalists, as you said, were very much like that. Alexander Hamilton was supremely confident that he knew what was good for America, and he was going to go out and do it. But Madison and Hamilton's opponents thought, actually, this guy's just selling out regular people's interest to the national bank, right? That's really what causes the original formation of this Democratic Republican political party, of which Madison is really the central leader in the House of Representatives anyway. And yeah, you have the sense that, okay, you can say you're doing everything for the common good, but we actually need to contest that. We need vigorous contestation over what that's actually all about. If you just sort of try to say we have an anointed set of guardians who are going to do the right thing, well, Americans are not a trusting bunch of people. It does not work for us.
Well, and so you hit on it there, and you talk about it in the book, where you talk about like Madison kind of was the leader of this party in the House of Representatives, right? He saw this overarching federal executive power growing, and the response to the growing federal power was a check with the congressional power through the party that he built, right? And then in the book, you lay this out in the World War II era with Franklin D. Roosevelt and Congress, and the way that Congress kind of pushes back. Now, they do abdicate a little bit of the responsibilities because nobody seems to want to make really hard decisions in Congress through the history. But they do push back, at some point, and kind of like curtail a lot of Roosevelt's really more extreme views. And like, isn't that kind of our pathway forward, as far as like Americans and the powers? And you mentioned it in your opener about how like people just want to get rid of Congress, but Madison saw it right. Congress is the people's power. If you're going to check a bureaucratic executive that's, infiltrating, I don't know, oppressing you or whatever you might call it, then you do it through the House, through Congress.
Yeah, I mean, I think in World War II, you had a situation where Congress sensed its own limitations, but didn't just recede into the background because of having, I mean, it's true that most legislators just felt like they didn't have a whole lot to contribute to figuring out how to win the war. And they were probably right about that. But in terms of maintaining trust in the government, figuring out how we were going to finance this war, all these really important questions, how we were going to deal with, massive inflation and rationing and all that, like those were things that Congress felt like it did have competency to deal with, and it was not just going to defer blindly to the executive just because a war was on. And I think a lot of that history has been forgotten. But yeah, Congress needs to have confidence in its closeness with the people, right? Mm-hmm. It's we have every reason to think that members of the House in particular are better acquainted with what the American people really cares about and wants than the president is. The president has a tendency to sort of view everything from 30,000 feet. I mean, there's some good things about that view from 30,000 feet. And especially for foreign policy and war making, like that's probably a better view. But in terms of figuring out like what's actually important to us, what do we need to work on most? That's what you really need closeness to the people for. And that's what the House has. Even today, even as many problems as we have, I still believe that members of the House just are much better acquainted with what people in their district think.
Yeah. I mean,
there was an example that you talked about sort of pre-World War II in this, where you say like, well, there was sort of Congress had this reputation as being isolationist, and you kind of flip it back and say, no, really, they were just sort of, they were close to their constituents, and the constituents like, why would we be part of this war that's all the way on the other side of the world when we've got all our own problems at home? And I think, to me, that reminds me of sort of the current Ukraine debate, and probably the Israel debate, the Israel-Hamas war debate right now, where there's a big push that like the U.S. has to get involved in these wars. And I think there are a number of people in Congress who say, my constituents are kind of like, why should we get involved in this? And I remember walking down the hallway at work one day, and I was just hearing two people that work in the air conditioning system just kind of shooting the breeze. And one of them was like, yeah, they're talking about like we're sending money to Ukraine and we're not sending money to help people in Floridas, or I forget what the current disaster was, but like we're spending money overseas, but we're not spending money at home. And I think a lot of people feel that, and I think like that's where some of this pushback in Congress is. Where I think even there's a quote in the book like, we don't want to give a blank check to FDR, and I was like, that's exactly what people say now about the Ukraine funding, and like that's so much like that's Congress's responsibility to take that emotion and like bring it up to the appropriate level.
Right. No, so I think, in the case of the late 1930s, there was this very, very bad hangover from World War One. And, there was a sense of just total futility when Americans thought about what that war had accomplished or done, and why had they sent these American boys over to be maimed or killed. And that was very deeply felt. And, so in historical perspective, was FDR right to be farsighted and like basically imagine America coming to the aid of Britain and opposing Hitler? Yes, he was. That was good leadership. But just because you have a good leadership at the top doesn't bring the people around automatically. You need to actually address people where they are, right? That's sort of the key dynamic of persuasion has almost become foreign to people, but persuasion is like the key to Madisonian politics, and persuasion requires meeting the person where they are, addressing arguments to them that they will find persuasive, not just working things out in some rigorous logic that economists or foreign policy gurus will approve of. You actually have to go to people's concerns where they are. And yeah, I think that's the same situation with Ukraine. I personally think that supporting Ukraine is a pretty good investment for America, but absolutely, that case has to be made to the American people against its most articulate attackers, right?
Mm-hmm.
If folks think that this is a waste of money or that we're just funding some corrupt government, like that case deserves to be aired out. Those arguments need to be heard. We need to have that argument. And what's remarkable to me about the Ukraine funding is just how little it's really been debated. It's so much money that we've sent already, and there's sort of an expectation that we do these deals amongst congressional leaders and just hustle it through. And meanwhile, concerns that I do think are totally valid and ought to be taken seriously just get glossed over.
Yeah, I mean, you say like Congress or power or whatever kind of needs to meet the people where they are, and that's like I talk about government as like just a communication structure, and like our Congress is the mechanism that people talk to their power, right? The executive is supposed to address Congress, not necessarily the people, because there was no television when we first started. Like they worked through the Congress, and then the Congress went out to their districts and they communicated back and forth, and they brought back what the people had to say, and they explained what the executive had to say. Well, now the executive kind of circumvents that, and FDR did that with his fireside chats. So there is no meeting the people where they are anymore. And then even if you did, we have this really big problem where our districts are way too big. So if you did try to meet the people where they are, you would have just too many people to talk to. You have too much responsibility for the congressperson to communicate back and forth with. And so, back to this like idea of like the Madisonian politics and the multiplicity of factions is like Congress needs to be a check on the executive, and they need to be a large enough body to meet the people where they are and have conversations in the communities in order to bring it back to the body of Congress and actually push back on the executive, because they'll have confidence if they actually believe the people are behind them. But right now, they can't possibly know if the people are behind them because they can't talk to their district because they're just far too large.
I think that's a little bleaker than I would judge things. I agree it would be easier if the districts were smaller, but I think part of the frustration is like, how can an American citizen in a republic of 330 million people hope to have any kind of meaningful voice at all, right? There's just kind of this math problem that we're not even related to the number of representatives, but just the size of the country, right? When America got started, it had like 3 or 4 million people. That's a huge change, right? And I do think that, like, part of the reality of dealing with politics today is the sense of helplessness or powerlessness that the average citizen, even like the average well-connected citizen, is likely to have. So I think that's a real issue about just sort of politics in the 21st century. It's a hard problem.
Well, there's a sort of an intellectual argument you could bring, like that's where you have to bring things down to local level as much as possible. And I think part of the problem tends to be like the over federalization of everything. And I think the local and state level are robbed of too much of stuff, because there's, the Congress puts a program out and says, you do these things and you'll get some
Right.
money back. And so you get in this weird cycle where, even though technically the Congress hasn't made any laws about what you should do at a local level, they have these incentives as carrots and sticks that get localities to do certain things. And then your congressman is even more important, because it's this federal funding that now people are used to, and if they don't get any more, it now becomes a burden on the locality that they weren't used to. So that's part of the problem too. I'm like, the subsidiarity versus solidarity, where just trying to put things at that right level is could be one of that fixes, where for that one person in 330 million, it's much easier to go to their board of supervisors member that is only representing 100,000 people to get what they need done, if there was less kind of an umbrella over that.
I totally agree with that.
Yeah.
I mean, I have to say that I live in Montgomery County, Maryland, which is a population of about 1 million people, and we're just one school district and one county government, which is very powerful. And I have to say, I feel pretty disempowered within my local government also, in a way that's very dispiriting.
I'm a proponent of uncapping the stake houses as well, just to FYI.
Well, that I wouldn't. I mean, the state houses are so dominated by one party in my state that it's like, I don't even know what they're up to, but it's not. It doesn't. I don't feel like it's on my behalf, really. So yeah, I'm totally sympathetic to the idea that like smaller units would be better for a sense of empowerment, better for sort of Republican self-government responsibility, all that. Like a lot of the Christopher Lasch kind of arguments really resonate with me, where he sort of, the point is, people become responsible by having power. Not, you don't just need to find the responsible people and then give them power. It works the other way around. You really need to let people make their own mistakes, even as a way of educating people in the difficulties of governance, which are deep and inextricable with the human condition, I suppose.
Well, and kind of this locality thing that John was talking about later in the book, you talk about the COVID situation and kind of Congress's reaction to that. And when I was reading this, I couldn't help, and obviously we lived it, this was only a few years ago, so it's not like the history and the rest of the books, but I couldn't help thinking, like, I feel like the states really failed in a lot of ways here. We can blame Congress and we can blame the executives, but at the end of the day, like, I think the states were unprepared. They didn't want to act, and they were just, basically twiddling their thumbs, waiting for the federal, executive and Congress to do something. And isn't that another way that we can check and balance our system so people are more represented?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the states often showed kind of a herding instinct, where they just wanted to do what the National Institutes of Health or the Centers for Disease Control or whomever came up with, even when there wasn't really any reason to think that those people were doing a very good job. And yeah, that's like, oh, there's plenty of blame to go around with COVID. Really, no shortage. So I agree with you. I think my point with Congress is that there were actually some national level things happening um, that Congress really ought to have been grappling with. And really, it just is amazing how little they did. They sort of acknowledged that there were fights about these things, but they never even made a real try at resolving them. And I think they could have done some good if they had been willing to work through the difficult trade-offs that COVID forced on us. But instead, it was just sort of passivity. We're saying, I'm following the science. No, I'm following the science. These kinds of self-abnegating arguments that just take the need for judgment out of the situation, even though that's what we desperately needed. So yeah, the name of that chapter is "We Needed Leadership, They Gave Us Cash."
Yeah.
And that's really, we really needed people at some levels to just take responsibility and say, I know this is a hard situation. I know that whatever choice I make is going to have downsides to it, but nevertheless, this is the right thing to do. I mean, I think that's part of the pitch that Ron DeSantis was able to make for a little while, is that he had done something more like that in Florida for a time, and they had sort of said, we're willing to take the hit because we think keeping Florida's businesses open is important to us. And that at least sort of seemed like a decision made in full consciousness of sort of what was going on. Not that I would want to defend everything that he did on that front, but I do think that was part of the appeal.
Yeah.
But there was weird like federal aspects too. Like you mentioned, there's a lot of cash that came in, but I'm on the school board in Loudon, and there was the sort of this idea of federal conveyances where this like obscure section of federal code, which then became a rule for the CDC to sort of imposing things where you had to have school buses in a certain configuration with masking and things. And so like it was taking rules in the federal code that I think were never intended to be used in these ways and then applying them to certain situations.
Right.
So that would have been a purview of Congress to actually like to
Right.
have a judgment on that and say like, yeah, that's don't interpret it that way. But again, like they just sort of deferred everything to the CDC, to the NIH. And then we got again like a fight again, like there was no multiplicity. It was sort of a singularity, and it was either if you go along with it or you're stuck.
Right.
And I think having those, even if the same outcome had happened, but you had a floor debate about it, I think it would have been a much more positive thing. Kind of like what you talked about the civil rights stuff later on in the book.
Yeah, there was so much ability to, I mean, they just like threw so much money at these schools without even insisting that they be open. Gosh, yeah, it's just I don't even want to go down that road.
So you mentioned
too soon.
So wait,
hours, guys.
You mentioned in the book that there is, I made a note of it here. I believe there's like, I don't know the dollar figure, but there's like millions or billions of dollars that have been allocated for like educational COVID response that haven't been spent yet. And I think you mentioned that like it's probably just going to get spent for raises for teachers like over the next course of, I don't know, 10 or 15 years or something.
Yeah, I think that's a little dated from when I was writing. But yeah, there was all just enormous amounts of money sloshing through the system, and money is fungible. Like it's like they find ways of taking this money and essentially making use of it in ways that were never originally intended. So
I have an idea to do that, actually, because that's what Congress does, is it takes money that wasn't intended and spends it in other places because it's already been allocated, right? So like one of the big problems, I mean, COVID really, it stunted the growth of a lot of children in their educational lives. But more than that, the growth was already stunted because the system was broken. And if you talk to teachers and administrators, they believe that there aren't enough schools and there aren't enough teachers. The classrooms are too large. So, my idea would be, all right, let's take that money that was for COVID response and let's start building some more schools and hiring some more teachers. And let's get the class size down from, 30 down to like 20 or 15. So we can actually like have a conversation with the people in the room again. You know, it's my whole big thing about Congress is like, you have to have small groups in order to have a conversation or a debate. And whether it's in, you know, debate in Congress or listening and asking questions in the classroom, that is important in growth and understanding. So is that like, I mean, I'm not a scholar on Congress. Can you do that with the money?
I think the money is like kind of frittered away by now.
Oh,
I don't know that it's like there to be spent anymore. I mean, I'd have to talk to my education policy colleagues to be sure about that, but that's my impression. And yeah, I don't know. I'm sympathetic to what you say about class size, but it's like it's very that's a very expensive idea.
well, I mean, people push back on me and say, well, how are you going to pay for that? And I go, well, like, I get it, but like, if you're not educating the next generation, like you're paying
Right.
for it in the negative, you
Right.
know? Like,
No, I think that's why the current manifestation of school choice is just to say like just get the cash free away from the system and let people spend the cash and forge their own children's education in some other manner, because at some point it just starts to seem like lack of money isn't really the problem. It's like this whole system that makes bad use of it is the problem.
yeah. Well,
Yeah.
let's get back to Congress real quick because I kind of sidetracked us with education. John and I, you know, are both very involved in
Education, COVID, it all just kind of
yeah.
like rolls around.
So at the end of the book, you kind of lay out 3 futuristic scenarios, which I thought was very intriguing. And I was curious, you know, you mentioned you wrote it like a year or 2 ago. Is that correct? You wrote it during COVID, I assume, or a little afterwards. So thinking forward now, like what does, and all the information you have since you've written the book and the ideas that you put forth in the book, what does Congress need to do? Like, what's the
Yeah.
first step?
Well, let me just lay out the 3 scenarios at the end of the book. They're all sort of I took some artistic liberties and wrote from the perspective of some observers in 2039, because that's going to be the 250th anniversary of Congress. And so the 3 scenarios are decrepitude, rubber stamp, and revival. And yeah, the whole idea is that sort of Congress on the trajectory that it's on is sort of more and more marginalized over time, and it can become more marginalized still. It's not like it's reached the end of that path. So the first 2 scenarios really imagine it becoming even less powerful. In the first case, that's sort of by just becoming more of a wreck than it is now. And in the second case, it's by people who are reformers trying to sort of effectively subordinate it to the executive branch, which I think a lot of reformers would like to do. So that's the first 2 scenarios. And then the third scenario, the revival. So what do we need to get revival of Madisonian politics? That's your question now. So I think we need a lot of our national politicians to decide that they care more about legislating on some pressing issue than they care about exercising partisan loyalty and framing the next election. That's the basic key. And as much as I would like to think that reformers like myself could change things just by dint of our lovely arguments, I don't really think that's true. I think to get to a different dynamic in Congress, you need the legislators to just buy out of the current models, to just say, no, I refuse to be reduced in my station to just being a vote caster who does what the leader tells me to do and raises money for the party. That's beneath my dignity. I am a person of real political ambition who wants to do good for the American people, and that means I'm going to go out and solve these problems today, not after the next election. So that's what I've sort of been waiting for and hoping for. I think it's very interesting for me with that perspective to be watching the drama unfolding in the House of Representatives this year. I think one way to interpret it is that there are a lot of members on the right wing of the Republican Party who feel like they're just not wanting to play this game on the same terms anymore. They're just willing to smash it all to pieces because they have a sense that it's a losing game. And even if that means busting up their party and sort of driving everybody up the wall, they just have something has to be different. And I'm not sure I think that they have a very good strategy of how to get from here to there, but I do think that's part of how I understand their motivation. So I actually take what's happening in the House right now as a very positive first step, even though it is so messy and uncertain on the ground.
Yeah,
When you say smash to pieces, do you mean like Congress or just what you said, like the partisan structure
The
where
current
it's all about the
status
leader raising money? Yeah.
well, the status quo pattern in which the leaders are so dominant. We do so much legislating by deals between partisan leaders, and the rank and file membership is sort of reduced to an afterthought.
So I agree. I wrote a piece in the Hill this week about just that, and how you kind of break up that structure is going back to that progressive era where everything got messed up, is Reed's rules, which really consolidated a lot of power in the House to the leadership. And that kind of helped the partisan divide. So I think the first step, I wrote, whoever gets nominated speaker, the first thing they should do is they should get rid of Reed's rules. They should put the most qualified people on the committees and not just the people of their party. And then they should open up actual floor debate and make it a deliberative body again. Take the power out of the few, really, good campaigners, if you will, the people that raise money and control the system.
The telemarketers.
Take the power out of their hands. And, I think what would happen here is you would immediately get to see who is there to govern and who is there to grift. And then now allow the American people to vote these people out of office and put some better quality people in there that actually want to take time to learn specific issues and write good bills, because frankly, it just doesn't seem like they're interested in it at all. And like you said, if we're going to move Congress forward, we have to break up that partisanness that has just overtaken the body.
Well, let me tell you, Speaker Reed is really looking at you hard as you're saying all this. He's right over your shoulder in your office. Listen, I'm not sure I would put it all the way back to the progressive era, because part of the story that I'm telling in my book is that Congress of the mid 20th century just worked in an entirely different way. We had an era of power. The power centers in that Congress were the committee chairs, and the speaker, famous speaker Sam Rayburn. Nobody ever nicknamed him boss or czar like they did with Reed and Cannon, right? Sam Rayburn was Mr. Sam. He was this guy who was a masterful practitioner of human relations, who got these strong personality chairmen to work with each other and to figure out how this crazy coalition that was the Democratic Party back then could hang together. That's just a very different model of how Congress could be. I like getting from here to there would take a lot of steps, because right now chairmen serve more or less at the pleasure of the speaker, and it's not just the membership of the committees; it's the chairman, and we have a sense that basically people do get rewarded with chairmanships by how prolific fundraisers they are. So yeah, I'd like to see that reversed. And the Rules Committee itself. The Rules Committee is sort of the central tool of speaker control of the agenda. Again, going back to look at what the model was in the mid 20th century, the Rules Committee was independently elected. It it was not just the creature of the speaker. It was something that reflected the diversity of the membership, and the chairman of the Rules Committee was this amazing, powerful figure in his own right that did not just take direction from the speaker. So, yeah, I'd like to see a devolution of power away from the speaker. We need to, when we think about how that would happen, we actually need to think about not just hoping that the speaker appoints different kinds of people, but actually getting the power out of the speaker's hands in the first place.
Writing new
So
rules.
that means, yeah, we need to look at, these steering committees, which are not really very public bodies. They're the ones that make appointments to the committees. We need to shake those things up. I like ideas to shake up the way committees work and the way committees are able to get things to the floor. So some people say, hey, what if the committee's members got to elect their own chairman? I like reforms that say, what if committees are guaranteed that if they can do a bipartisan bill in their committee, that it's definitely going to get votes on the floor? That's not the case today. You can work really hard and write a great bill in committee that gets 85% of the members on the committee to all agree that this is a good bill, and there's no guarantee it will ever get a vote if it doesn't suit the speaker's agenda. And that's really trouble. We don't have the incentive. So once you think that your bills that you work on in committee aren't going anywhere, well, then you better spend your time doing something else if you're smart. So we need to shift that. We need to sort of, we need to reward the workhorses and not the show horses so much.
So what would, I mean, I propose that election or like campaign finance reform should be a big part of that. I mean, at the end of the day, a lot of the reasons we have people that are partisan or kind of like all of the incentive is about fundraising and how you get the power is like, well, we have to take that away. Like that shouldn't be the focus point. I mean, when I ran for Congress, everybody kept on trying to tell me like, well, you have to do this, you have to do this, you have to do this. And I'm like, I'm pretty sure I have to study history and understand law. Like, I feel like that's what my job is. And I need to like know my community. So that's what I focused on running for Congress. But at the end of the day, they're right. If you want to be in Congress, you don't have time to do any of that stuff. The only thing you have time for is to fundraise and campaign. Now, once you get to Congress, or maybe you studied before you got there and you were kind of prepared, but from the people that I talked to, the staffers, the few congressional people I've spoken with, you don't have time to study and read law or read the bills that they pass. You have to continuously campaign. Right. And continuously fundraise. So like if we want a body that functions, that's able to debate these complex issues, don't we need to get that off their plate? Like I tell my wife, like I wore a flannel for 2 straight years because it was one less thing that I needed to think about. And now that I'm having to wear it, I finally committed to wearing something different. And I was complaining the other day and I was like, babe, I'm just sick and tired of dressing. And she goes, you've been out of a flannel for a week and you're complaining already. I'm like, look, it's just one extra thing that I don't want to have to deal with. And it's the same thing with Congress. People in my community, they're like, are you going to run for Congress again? And I go, not if I have to beg people for money. I'm not going to run. I just don't. That's not how the system was designed. I don't want to have to be a panhandler to be a leader in my community.
I've never really been a campaign finance guy. It's just, I don't know why. That's writing this book has made me somewhat more sympathetic to the idea that this is a problem that has to be addressed. And I think you put your finger on it, which is the time piece of it. It's kind of a destructive arms race that everyone is locked into and nobody can opt out of unilaterally. So we need to get people out of it all at the same time. And it would just seem like an enormous gain to the institution's ability to function if we could just say, all these hours that you're spending on this all the time, how about you spend them doing the work of the American people? That's very, very attractive to me. I don't know exactly how to implement it. I think
persuasion.
Yeah, the more we could lock members in rooms with each other, away from cameras, away from their staff even, just say, I actually think the members, if you gave them a chance, they would do a lot of good work.
I agree with that.
And the system is kind of designed to systematically deprive them of the chance, which is kind of crazy.
Yeah, I mean, I view all this from the outside and kind of reading history. So like I don't have any inside knowledge of a lot of people, but just from my like understanding of human nature and how people behave, my assumption is that like 70% of people in Congress really want to do something great and they love their country. And the other 30% have control of the system and are doing what they're doing with it. And like, but that is what happens when you have a republic that has concentrated power. Is like that power is going to continue to get concentrated, and it's going to be in the hands of the wrong people when you don't have a deliberative body, a large enough deliberative body to diversify that power. And so I just think it is the nature of the beast that we've created, and we just have to work on systematically changing it through, doing the job that we were supposed to do. Congress was supposed to apportionment, like repeal or write a new apportionment bill, expand the House out, get a speaker in there that doesn't focus with rules that aren't partisan, make it a more deliberative body, write some campaign finance reform. I mean, yeah, maybe it'll take 10, 12 years, but you'll see a dramatic difference in the way that the body functions, because it'll be a communication piece again. Get the media out of the way. If you make the district smaller, the representatives can spend time actually in their community. If they're not having to campaign as much, they have more time to spend in their community. And I just, I think it's kind of common sense reforms that we can make that would, move us forward.
I'll give you just some conversational pushback on the larger size. I do think there's an issue of, I mean, if you had 100,000 members of the House of Representatives, then I think if you throw a number out there like that, I think to me it's obvious that like you no longer have a body that could be based on personal relationships between these legislators at all, right? You just they can't hope to know each other. They would have to be running everything through layers of hierarchy. And so you would actually have a body sort of more dominated by a small sliver of the membership. And so that seems pretty obvious to me. And I think then the question is like, at what numbers do you start getting into those problems very profoundly? And Madison talks about this in the Federalist Papers. He says at some point, if you have a large enough representative body, it starts having the problems of the mob, essentially.
Right. Well,
and I think for me, I worry that like getting back to anything like the district size we had, in the 19th century would cause us to have a body that would just be so large that it would be mob-like. I think knocking us down to 500,000 members per district instead of 750,000 would leave you with a body that maybe isn't so different in its dynamics than the one we have now. That seems like an experiment that I'm not against trying.
That's my proposal. My proposal would be to write a new apportionment bill for 2030, and where we would basically just cut our districts in half. So they would go down to like 400 and something thousand. You would expand the House from 435 to 870, right? Now I think Danielle Allen wrote a piece in the Washington Post that explains where you can actually fit this number of people in the House. You can fit up to like 1,100 or so. And so, because that's the first question that people ask me, well, where would they sit? And I go, well, that's the last thing I care about is where they sit, right? Put them in a hotel together. I don't care. But like, you cut the districts in half, it becomes more manageable. It will be easier for somebody like me or John to run for office. It would cost less, right? You would get a more representative body of the people, because at the end of the day, part of the reason that Congress fails is regular people cannot run for office. There is a massive wealth barrier between you as a citizen and your power, and that's not how the body's supposed to be. So simply by, spreading it out, it'll be a little bit easier. It'll still take a little bit of money, but middle class husbands and wives will have the opportunity to run again and win office.
Well, if I may, like, I think you talk in the beginning about sort of the origins of Parliament as a whole, and we think about Parliament now, it's like 600, 700 members. I think that's something to consider too. Like, there are big deliberative bodies that are able to kind of get things done in terms of like they do stuff in Britain. So I think there is precedent that you can actually have a big body that can do some kind of deliberation. Now, I do agree with your point that if it gets too big, you sort of have like almost middle management layers where, and I think like what we have now, where there's the speaker, there's the majority leader, minority leader, there's the whip, all sorts of sort of leadership positions that sort of manage people. And I think you might get more of that, but I think having more of a ruckus would give us that multiplicity that is missing, and and more of the ferment that it's kind of missing too. Like it is so stayed between, like, it's the Democrats versus the Republicans. And what is so remarkable about the speaker fight is that there were 8 people that were willing to buck their majority and sort of like mess things up, and that's so rare. And I think it might be better if there's more of that.
Yeah, I think what was remarkable in the playing out of this drama was also after Jim Jordan got the nomination of the conference, that then these 20 to 25 members were willing to buck that decision also. So we started seeing it wasn't just the most far right 8 who were willing to do it or something. It was a larger group who was starting to say, hey, we're just not going to play along as a unified team anymore. And I think from the Republican Party's internal perspective, this is a big disaster, and they're really have a lot of troubles sort of putting Humpty Dumpty back together again. But yeah, from the body's perspective, I do think, seeing this kind of willingness to chart a new path seems very healthy.
So
so in 2024, when the Democrats have the majority, you get AOC, who has a motion to vacate, and gets, there's no speaker fight in the Democratic. We'll see the flip side of that.
Could be, right. Yeah, I mean, Nancy Pelosi was a towering figure, and I don't know that there's any reason to suppose that Hakeem Jeffries can just somehow effortlessly inherit that. I think that they have plenty of their own internal difficulties that it's going to be hard for them to.
So I tell people all the time that the 2-party system has already failed. It's just that nobody else has seen it yet. And that's because I read history and I know how these things play out. And I'm telling you, both the Republicans have been fractured through Trump, and the Democrats are going to go through the same thing. And I think the American people are fed up. And I think that it's only a matter of time before something pushes that change. I don't know what it's going to be, right? I'm working towards some sort of goal to get that, a third voice in there, just somebody. But I think that the divisions have already been wrought, and that those 8 people that kind of dissented, and then the 20 people that dissented as the Republicans against Jordan, like, all it would have taken is a really highly thoughtful, charismatic individual in the room to bring somebody around to the table from the Democrats to get a nomination of a speaker that was going to focus on reform of the body of Congress. Because at the end of the day, that's what we need. We need congressional reform. It needs to be a body that's deliberative, and it needs to be a body that can check the executive. So people have power, as you mentioned in your opener. If we just get rid of Congress, where does the people's power go?
Yeah, I share your I share the sense that there were a lot of tantalizing possibilities in the last month that didn't get realized. I do think it's easier to imagine again some kind of bucking the current system if you have a particular policy goal you're trying to achieve, and not just reform for its own sake. So I go back to this famous moment in 1910 quite a lot, where Reed's successor as the leader of the Republican Party back then was a man named Joseph Gurney Cannon. And I really would encourage people to learn about Cannon. He was a really fascinating figure. But he was sort of led his party with an iron grip, and eventually the progressive Republicans joined forces with Democrats to break his power. And they did that not just because they were fed up with being bossed around, but because they wanted to pass some railroad regulations that Cannon did not want to pass. And that was so important to them. I mean, the railroads were such a monstrous, important industry. It's hard for us to imagine today how important they were to the country. But
it's like today's big tech. That's what it is.
Well, maybe so.
I say it all the time.
Yeah, I mean, there are certainly a lot of interesting left-right collaborations about what to do about big tech. I find those pretty intriguing. But so far, they're not the kinds of things people have been willing to buck their party to do. They're sort of sensitive feelers.
What about immigration? Because you mentioned immigration in the book, and kind of how it's been stalemated. There's been some progress, but then it falls apart because of the party structure, and it doesn't get done. And John and I were talking about it on the podcast a few weeks ago. I mean, this is a big problem. Like, maybe that's the thing. Maybe that's the thing that's beside reform that drives the force. If somebody can come up with a real good plan.
That seemed like the most likely candidate to me, but it is kind of amazing how successful the two parties seem to be in just transforming this into a somehow neatly polarized issue. It somehow seems less cross-cutting than it did. Right? Bernie Sanders, running for president in 2016, was kind of skeptical of immigration. That was one of his differences with Hillary Clinton. But that kind of dissent in the Democratic Party has largely been squashed, I feel like, in recent years. I don't know, you hear Mayor Eric Adams standing up and talking about what a disaster having this wave of refugees come to New York City is. You do feel like this is such an important issue. It's so disruptive. People have such strong feelings about it. Maybe it can shake things up. So yeah, I would say I think that's in some ways seems like a place to watch. But I will say the practitioners of the current model are good at what they do. They're good at keeping people locked into their battle lines. That's kind of the thing that surprises me most about American politics year after year, is just how good they are at their jobs, at sort of keeping people feeling like they have to just fall back onto their party's line. I've never been there myself. I've sort of felt pretty alienated from both parties my entire adult life. And I know there's lots of other Americans like me, but we're sort of not assertive enough to call the shots at this point.
But I mean, what I tell people, because I literally spend most of my days just like talking to random strangers in my community. Like, I work only in the office for like the first 4 hours a day, and then I go to a coffee shop or a brewery and I sit and I just talk to people. And I hear that same thing for so many people. Nobody, like, there are so few people, 756,000 people in the District 10. And what I found is there are about 20,000 Republicans and Democrats. Everybody else is like an independent, right?
Well,
And I tell people, you're the majority. Like, you guys are the majority. Like all it takes is some coalescing body, some organizing body around the people that are disenfranchised by the Republicans and the Democrats. And there is your big change. And I think, that's what Principles First is trying to do. That's what Forward Party is trying to do. My argument with those two bodies is they're doing it the same way. They're doing it from a top-down structure. If you want to make real change, you have to do it from the bottom up. And that's the Madisonian multiplicity of factions that really makes the difference. So,
I will say, obviously there's just like structural things about the money, but also just about ballot access today that make it so hard for any outsider group to gain any traction, right? When we look back to how did the Whig Party go extinct in the 1850s, and we got the rise of the Republican Party, but there was like we had the American Party, there was like a lot of weird stuff going on. And part of the story is that parties could literally print their own ballots and distribute them to their supporters back then. So you would come to the polling place with the ballot that your party printed for you, and you would drop it in the box, such that it's a totally different model on how people can enter into the political system. And so yeah, I'm pretty down on how hard it is for people to break in to the system today. I feel like that is a basic sort of structural barrier to competition that obviously the two parties like, and the rest of us should be working to change. I think the trouble with mobilizing this group is that they're right. The thing that's the strongest in American politics is negative polarization. It's not so much that I feel close to the Republican Party, it's that I hate the Democrats so much, right? And I think so. Just because there's this huge body of people out there who don't like either party, that doesn't mean that they could all get along together. And I think I do share your sense that there are some real opportunities there, but I think it's just thinking about all the disaffected people and imagining them all getting together maybe skips a couple of steps.
No, it's so true. I was watching a TV ad yesterday, and this friend of mine is running for office, who was a year ahead of me in high school. Like, the ad was saying that he's going to put doctors in jail, and I was like, I don't think that's true, but like it's just it's total negativity about everything. Very little positive.
That's an interesting platform. That's new to me.
Well, Philip, I really appreciate you joining us. This has been fantastic. I've looked forward to this all week. Like I said, I read your book this week. You wrote in another book too. Where is it? It's over here. Congress Overwhelmed. I think you participated in that book, right? You wrote a chapter of that. Yeah.
Yes,
so
good.
It's fantastic. Before we leave, I want to ask you kind of a lighthearted question. It seems that you obviously study this stuff. You've studied history. Who do you admire in our history? Like United States history, like what is a leader that you admire, and why do you admire him?
Oh, that doesn't seem so lighthearted to me.
It's fun.
Like now we're getting to the crux of the matter. A great question. I tend to like people's stories that are a little bit unusual. I don't know. There's a lot of people worth admiring. I have a lot of congressional biographies. It's not the shelf that's behind me on my camera. I have a different bookshelf over here that's full of my Congress books. One I like is this guy, Senator Mark Hatfield of Oregon. Somebody most people don't remember today. He was a longtime Republican senator, and he was the chairman of the Appropriations Committee in the Senate in the 104th Congress. That's after the 94 midterms, and he ended up casting like a deciding vote against a balanced budget amendment, which was like a deeply unpopular vote. And like just learning the story of why he did that, he did it out of like a deep conviction that the amendment that was actually before them just wouldn't work, and it was just going to be a big governance disaster. And he was willing. He had somebody who had said that he wanted a balanced budget amendment in the past, but when it actually came time, and this was the amendment that they were voting on, he thought it couldn't work. And so there were all these members who wanted him thrown out of the party after he cast this vote, but he did it. So I don't know. Congress is a place. I mentioned this in the book. Congress is kind of a place that's a little bit hard to tell stories about. It's hard to find heroes because the nature of legislative work is so there's so many choices and so many relationships that go into it. So it's not just like a tidy tidy narrative where sort of Mr. Smith Goes to Washington is like not really to the point, because it's like this guy just shows up and makes everything change all of a sudden. But that's not really how a lot of folks who ought to be our legislative heroes really operated. Like, they went in there and they formed these relationships over decades. And, you know, some of them, like a lot of Republicans from the mid 20th century who are interesting figures, they like labored their whole careers in the minority. Like, there's a guy, a House member from New York who I admire a lot, named Barbara Conable. And he ended up being the ranking member of the Ways and Means Committee. That was sort of where he topped out in the 1980s, because Republicans didn't have the majority until after he left Congress. But yeah, I try to find stories like that. I think Congress is a place where people exhibit a lot of really admirable characteristics, and we need a political culture that digs that up and brings out. It's so easy to tell stories about presidents, and like I'm as attracted to those stories as anybody else. But I have the sense that part of a project that's worth doing is just trying to like raise people's awareness of and interest in the stories of Congress, because I think those are severely neglected in our sort of collective memory.
That's awesome. I love it. I mean, that's what I'm all about. I find it, I read presidential biographies all the time. It is hard to find any type of biography about somebody like that, you know? So the fact that you have and you've put into a book in a lot of ways is awesome. I really admire that. And I think, you know, I mentioned I talk to people in coffee houses and breweries, and they are all looking for answers. They watch the news, and at the end of the day, they're scared a little bit. And so what I would recommend to them is read this book. At the end of the day, like, seriously, read the book. Like, it, you know, between this book and that book right there, Acts of Congress, I mean, they're two really well-written books that show, you know, this one, your book, kind of shows the history of how Congress has evolved and shaped, and, you know, some ideas to like reform it or make it a more functioning body. And then that one back there kind of it just tells you the real life story of how dysfunctional it is. And so you can see all the flaws, so you can work to this one to like make it better.
Is that the one about Dodd-Frank?
Yes. Have you read it? Yeah, it's fantastic. I read it the week before. But I was blown away. I mean, again, lived through it, but you know, I was in my early 20s when that happened, so I really wasn't paying much attention to it. I was just glad that my business didn't shut down during the economic crisis of 2008.
Yeah. Well, I can wave my other book at you too.
Oh, you got another
book. I wrote another book earlier. It's called To the Edge: Legality, Legitimacy, and the Responses to the 2008 Financial Crisis.
Ooh, I'll have to get that one. That one plays right into what I'm reading about.
Yeah. So I have things to say on that. So maybe you'll have me back someday and we'll have a chat about that.
Awesome. Well, I really appreciate you joining us. John, anything before we get out of here?
No, again, thank you, Philip. I love what I've read so far, and it's I will say my favorite part, you know, not just the speak of the beginning, but this idea of like Parliament. You know, we think about Parliament so much, and it's just sort of this sort of French portmanteau of sort of people speaking together, and that is so much of what's missing from Congress is, again, like representatives actually talking with each other. And I think if more people realize that, I think we'll have the reforms that we all kind of desire.
All right. Well, thanks so much for having me, guys. This has been a great conversation. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, that was a wonderful interview. John, any final thoughts?
Jeff, everyone who listens to this podcast has to read this book, Why Congress, by Philip Wallach, our guest today, because he just, like, you know, you and I have been talking about this for a long time, I guess for like a year together, but we had these thoughts for a while. And then to have someone else independently corroborate everything, it's just like, you know, it's kind of like, it's like calculus, you know, it wasn't just Newton that invented it. There were other people at the same time inventing it. So like, we're all realizing there are problems and there are solutions. So I can't recommend this book enough. It's got a great like historical perspective, and then it's just kind of like practical at the end. So I totally recommend everyone else picking up a copy, reading it. You will you'll love it.
Absolutely. Once again, definitely go pick up his book, Why Congress, and read it, share it, talk about it, right? Instead of getting in fights with your neighbors and friends at Thanksgiving in December over, different Republican and Democratic talking points, how about, diving into the history of Congress and talking about congressional reform to move this forward? I don't know, just an idea I have. Maybe a little less fighting, a little bit more debating at your local or holiday traditions. Also, I was lucky enough to be published in both Newsweek and The Hill recently. So if you have an opportunity,
Congratulations.
go check out those articles, click on them, because clicks get you paid, right, John? You got to. I want to be. I
Not if
want to
you're
be
not
invited
if you're an
back.
op-ed writer. You don't get paid for if you're an op-ed writer. But we'll put the links in the show notes so that everyone can read them, and we'll get Jeff published in more places.
Absolutely. So, and remember always, like, subscribe, and share. Peace and love.